Thank you for the introduction, Gabby. People pass away, and everything a man had in his head is lost forever. So observed prosecution witness Benno Cohn during his testimony at the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Similar expressions of concern about the evanescence of Holocaust memory can be found in witnesses from each of the three periods identified by Annette Viviorka in her book, very well-known book, The Era of the Witness. They appear in the diaries and the letters composed by inmates of the camps and ghettos, as well as in the records of the honor courts convened in DP camps immediately after the Shoah. They appear in the statements of Cohn and the scores of other witnesses who testified at the Eichmann Trial. And they appear in quantity in the audio-visual testimonies collected by archives and libraries throughout the world, beginning in the late 1970s and continuing up until today. So my goal today in this paper is to consider one very particular scholarly aim that I think these masses of collected memories, to use Christopher Browning's term, can help to advance. I'm going to assess the evidence that these testimonial sources can provide for the phenomenon that I call the phenomenon of norm transformation during the Holocaust. Now, the notion that norms, and particularly changes in norms, play an important explanatory role in our understanding of the crimes of the Holocaust appears in the work of many leading scholars, particularly of the most recent generation. So it appears in influential studies over the past 20 or 25 years by Christopher Browning, Jan Gross, Claudia Kuhns, Alon Confino, and others. This claim receives support from documents produced by the planners and perpetrators of atrocities themselves. And in short, I think this claim, it's well suited for inclusion in what Professor Kovacs already referred to as Saul Friedlander's account of the integrated and integrative history of the Holocaust. Now the complication. Despite the broad recognition within these sources of the significance of norms, and particularly changes in norms, for understanding the Holocaust, important questions remain unaddressed. So historians rarely make explicit their definition of norms, or distinguish among different kinds of ways that norms can change. Scholars disagree on whether particular features of the Holocaust are best explained by the disappearance of norms, their absence or breakdown, or by the emergence of new and vicious norms in new contexts. And finally, despite the sophistication, which we've already seen today, with which contemporary historians and other scholars unite documentary materials with testimonial sources, they haven't analyzed the specific kinds of challenges that arise for using testimonial sources to talk about norms, specifically, as opposed to other kinds of historical information or details. So in this paper, I'm a philosopher by training, not a sociologist, though there are overlaps, I think, in some of the methodological questions I'll raise. I'm going to first talk about, these historiographical and epistemic issues. I'm going to first provide an explicit definition of norms and norm transformation, so you have a better idea of what I'm talking about, how the philosophical literature understands these things. Next, I'm going to propose, but fairly tentatively, some baseline assumptions about what we should think about, where norms were, how they existed, where they disappeared during the Holocaust. And this is a matter for debate. I don't make any sort of definitive claims about this. These are proposals that I'd love to discuss with you. And finally, and I think most significantly, I'm going to identify two particular challenges to using testimonial sources specifically to confirm or disconfirm claims about norms and norm transformation during the Holocaust. And I have a PowerPoint mainly to put up some definitions and some longer quotes. So first, I understand norms as practical prescriptions, prohibitions, and permissions accepted by individuals belonging to particular groups, organizations, or societies, and capable of guiding the actions of those individuals. This definition of a norm differs from the merely statistical notion of a norm, that it's the norm that most of the people in here are not wearing ties, for example, is that sort of statistical notion. Because this notion aims to explain, rather than simply to register or record, group-level behavioral regularities. And it does so by focusing on the normative beliefs and attitudes that help to guide the actions of individuals and pattern the conduct of groups. In a very simplistic example, we've heard from Gabby, 20 minutes is the time limit for presentations. Yeah, I will do my best to stick by that norm, and he will enforce it if I don't. Within the philosophical literature on norms, theorists focus chiefly on 2 points. First, explicating how norms guide action. And second, distinguishing amongst different kinds of norms, so legal norms, moral norms, or social norms. Now, I think within the historiography of the Holocaust, legal and moral norms have been the focus of much of the discussion, but in some discussions of bystanding, there has been some interest in social norms and how those might explain bystander behavior. And norms, whether legal, moral, or social, they're susceptible to changes across several kinds of dimensions. So changes may affect the range of actions covered by a particular norm. They may affect the scope of the populations held accountable to particular norms, and they might affect the kinds of mechanisms used to enforce them. But in this paper, I'm going to focus on what you might think of as existential changes in norms, so changes that involve the creation or the destruction of norms, their emergence or their disappearance. And here are a few more definitions, and then I'll be done with the philosophical background. So I understand norm emergence as a process by which particular practical prescriptions, again, the definition of norms, begin to guide actions within specific groups, organizations, or societies. I understand norm breakdown as the process by which previously accepted norms cease to be accepted or followed by individuals or to pattern the conduct of groups. I hope that won't happen to this conference with respect to the 20-minute rule. It would be a bad thing. And finally, I understand norm inversion, which I'm not going to talk about much, which comes up often in the historiography of the Holocaust, as a hybrid process involving both the breakdown of some previously existing norm and the emergence of a new norm that's its opposite in some specific respect. And again, these definitions, they only provide a very brief account of a big philosophical literature, but I want to move now to the specific relevance of this for Holocaust studies. I'm sorry I didn't put these on the board here, but so yeah. So when assessing the role of norms, and especially changes in norms during the Holocaust, what should our baseline assumptions be? Here I'm going to stake out two proposals. I call the first assumption that I'm going to propose the presumption of norm presence, or persistence, as I considered calling it. And I call the second the shock of norm absence. So the presumption of norm presence refers to the defeasible assumption that norms exist and perform some action-guiding functions even amidst severe social and political turmoil. Turmoil might seem too weak a term. We'll get to that. This presumption is rooted in psychological research concerning the centrality of normative beliefs and attitudes for human cognition. It finds further support from case studies of the adaptability of particular norms to significant changes in social contexts. And political scientist Leanne Fuji, who studies comparative genocide studies, her work is on Rwanda specifically. So she writes, norms become more important when reality is confusing, contradictory, or changing. The more ambiguous the situation, the more likely people are to rely on norms as guides for behavior. I can say that's true being here in Israel for the very first time. I'm not acquainted with many of the norms involving both academic discourse and just social discourse, and so I'm quite attentive to what I imagine are norms that I'm seeing being enacted. So in the case of Holocaust studies, support for the presumption of norm presence comes from a variety of sources. It comes from the public record of racial laws used to exclude Jews and other persecuted minorities from social life. It comes from the secret or clandestine, not public, system of language rules employed by Nazi officials in order to conceal the policy and the procedures of mass killing. And it comes from the testimony of survivors like Isaac Kurtz, who 70 years after being deported to the labor camp Kittlestreben, recalls being told upon his arrival there in his Fortunoff archive testimony, quote, "This is not a kurort, a spa. This is a labor camp, and strict laws are being enforced over here." End quote. Now, I've said that the presumption of norm presence, what I've been talking about so far, is defeasible, and some of the most powerful observations and memories provided in Holocaust memoirs, video testimonies, etc., prompt us to question this presumption. I'm thinking here of Primo Levi's quite famous memory of asking why he had been kicked, I believe, on first arriving in Auschwitz and being told, "Here's kein warum, there is no why here." That question doesn't make sense. I'm thinking equally of an offhand comment, much less well known, made by a Hungarian survivor about her experiences in the same camp in her Shoah Foundation video testimony. Quote, "What can you do wrong in Auschwitz? Everything and nothing." Now, my brief analysis earlier of the different types of norm transformation gives us a tentative vocabulary for discussing the kinds of conditions that these witnesses are describing. These are conditions, I think, of thoroughgoing norm breakdown. That's a way of thinking about what they're describing. Testimonies like I've cited attest to the experience of shock and confusion upon confronting the absence of norms as waypoints for guiding behavior within the specific context of the camps, possibly also in some of the ghettos. The philosophical studies of norms that I draw on suggest that these feelings of dislocation should be expected wherever a pervasive breakdown in norms occurs. If it's really true that norms are a sort of central feature of our cognition of our environment, then finding that there's an absence or a disappearance of norms, that should be a surprising and a shocking experience. And it's that sort of expectation that I refer to as the shock of norm absence. So these two assumptions, the shock of norm absence and the presumption of norm presence, are, I think, complementary, actually. It's possible both for norms to have existed in some sites or stages of the Holocaust, and for norms to have broken down more or less completely in others. With respect to norms, as in many other respects, which I'm sure we'll hear about in the next few days, the Holocaust presents researchers with a differentiated and in some cases a contradictory historical reality. And by highlighting both the presumption of norm presence and the shock of norm absence, my goal is to acknowledge rather than to cover over this complex reality. Okay, now I'm going to turn to the final substantive section of the presentation where I talk about two specific methodological challenges to drawing evidence about norms and changes in norms from testimonial sources specifically. So by testimonial evidence, I don't need to go over this again because my two predecessors on the panel have talked about it. It's basically what was discussed as direct testimony, right? And I just note this because philosophers sometimes talk about testimony and testimonial knowledge in a very different way, which I'm happy to discuss. So I'm talking about diaries and letters written at the time of events. I'm talking about witness statements and testimony delivered during trials or other quasi-juridical proceedings after the events. And I'm talking about memoirs, oral histories, and other narrative accounts presented perhaps very far after the fact by direct observers or participants. In some previous work, I've suggested that testimonial sources of these different kinds are valuable for overcoming concerns about the circularity of norm-based explanations of historical events and actions. There's a worry of circularity where you observe a pattern of events and you say, well, that's evidence that there must have been some norm that produced that pattern of events. And then the norm is used to explain the pattern of events. That's a circular process. The idea is that maybe testimonial sources can help eliminate that worry about circularity. But here I'll consider two particular challenges to using testimonial evidence for knowledge of norm transformation. I've called the first of these, it's a bit untidy, the evaluative explanatory impasse. I'm sorry for the ugly phrase. And I call the second the problem of imperfect individual knowledge. So I'm anticipating a bit. The evaluative explanatory impasse holds that the frames of inquiry that supports legal or moral evaluation of the conduct of officials, individuals, and groups during the Holocaust differ from and are in some cases antithetical to the frames of inquiry that best support historical explanations of such conduct. And I've got here, a weak version of this challenge says that competing evaluative and explanatory aims can't be accomplished at the same time. A stronger version holds that the successful pursuit of one of these aims makes difficult or impossible the successful pursuit of the other. I'll discuss some examples. So the impasse I'm describing is most evident in discussions of perpetrator testimony. In post-war trials of perpetrators held in West Germany, the application of a legal code that required a particular kind of mental state as part of the crime of perpetrating murder gave defendants powerful reasons of self-interest for distorting both their empirical and their normative beliefs in their testimonies. This is well documented. Christopher Browning talks about this at length. Still more important for bringing this impasse to light, though, is the Eichmann trial itself, which I referred to at the beginning, right? Different commentators characterize the impasse in different ways. There's Hannah Arendt, famously and controversially, faulted prosecutor Hausner for trying to combine the aims of history and justice at the trial, she thought to the detriment of the justice part, perhaps not to the detriment of the history part. More recently, and in a different sort of tack, Richard Ashby Wilson, Christian Gerlach, and Christopher Browning have all discussed obstacles for historians who want to use Eichmann's various testimonies as sources of information about the decision on the final solution. Right? They all suggest that there can be something valuable to be got out of it, but there's specific kinds of obstacles to using it. But it's not just perpetrator testimony. This impasse also arises in discussions of survivor testimony, Lawrence Langer particularly. He accepts what I call the strong version of this impasse, right? And this is a long quote. He says, when former victims, entreating our sympathetic understanding, insist that the situations in which they found themselves in ghettos and camps were different, they're making a specific appeal to us to abandon traditional assumptions about moral conduct and the privileged distinctions between right and wrong that usually inspire such assumptions. So how should scholars who seek testimonial evidence of norm transformation during the Holocaust respond to this explanatory evaluative impasse? In the case of perpetrators, Christopher Browning has outlined a number of criteria for testing the veracity of perpetrator testimony. One of them is, if it goes against the apparent self-interest of the person to talk about particular events, then that's a sign that it's more trustworthy than if it's clearly in the service of their self-interest to describe events in a particular way. And the criteria he gives, he doesn't think that they're invulnerable or that they solve all the problems. I think that these criteria are helpful for evaluating perpetrator testimony about norms, just like perpetrator testimony about dates or about their being at a particular spot at a particular point in time. In the case of survivor testimony, especially testimony concerning the gray zone of the camps and ghettos, another kind of response is that the passage of time has largely superseded evaluative concerns that readers and interpreters of testimonial sources might have. So that focused discussion of the beliefs and actions of inmates of those places no longer has to provoke moral or political controversy. Not sure whether that's accurate or not. This response is suggested by my colleague Gabby Fender and Laura Jokush in the introduction to their recent volume on post-war Jewish honor councils. It might still be a controversial sort of response. Ultimately, what these responses suggest, though, is that juridical or quasi-juridical settings in which many testimonies, not the majority now, I would say, in the case that we have so many oral history testimonies, right? Those contexts were not so distortive of the content of testimonies as to render them invalid as sources of historical knowledge about the Shoah, and they suggest that we should accept the weak rather than the strong version of this challenge. First response to that challenge. Now I'll move on to the second challenge. This is the conclusion of the paper, problem of imperfect individual knowledge. This problem can best be introduced via some examples. So consider first these remarks from the testimony of Olga Kovacs, who was born in 1926 in the Hungarian town of Szolgotarian and deported with her mother Sari and her aunt Olga to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1944. Describing her interactions with these relatives in the camp, Olga recounts, I'm sorry, this is, I could have cleaned up the quote a bit, as she's speaking obviously in English. Somehow, I don't know what made us think. I never called her mother, only called her Sari. They did not know, except the people from our town, that we are relatives, because it was not good to have a relative in Auschwitz. I don't know who told us, but we saw on arrival that families are torn apart. Probably that's what gave us the idea. Now, first, this testimony is ambiguous between suggesting it was sort of prudential not to acknowledge your relatives in Auschwitz, or suggesting that there was an actual norm of some kind, perhaps a social norm against doing so. But more striking than this ambiguity is the slenderness of the epistemic basis for Olga's testimony on this point. She herself acknowledges that. To my mind, this testimony illustrates the tendency to look for norms, even in new and unusual settings, but it would be risky to form on the basis of this testimony even a tentative view that there actually was such a norm at Auschwitz about acknowledging relatives. But this unreliability might seem way overdetermined, given the extreme circumstances that Olga is describing in this camp, given her youth at the time that she was going through these events, and given the 50-year gap between the events themselves and when this particular testimony was offered. So let's consider a second source that shares none of those features, and we can see how far the problem of imperfect individual knowledge extends. This is an anecdote from Victor Klimper's diaries from 1934. Following a conversation with a family friend, he told us, in Falkenstein, one is not allowed to buy from the Jew. And so the people in Falkenstein travel to the Jew in Auerbach, and the Auerbachers in turn buy from the Falkenstein Jew. However, on bigger shopping expeditions, the people from the one-horse towns travel to Plauen, where there's a larger Jewish department store. If you run into someone from the same town, no one has seen anyone else. Tacit convention. Klimper records this without comment. Although it's secondhand, that's not the reason I'm singling it out. I want to highlight the fact it's unlikely that any single individual, observing this kind of behavior directly or only hearing about it, could really form a secure judgment about the existence of such an unspoken social norm. Right? And that brings us to the core of this problem about testimony. The very existence of norms, I've suggested, depends on the ability to develop shared normative beliefs and attitudes across individuals. But in the case Klemperer describes, or still more in the case Olga Kovacs describes, opportunities to communicate, to share those beliefs, to test them out against one another, are highly constrained. Individuals are reduced to guesswork, albeit high-stakes guesswork, about the existence or absence of norms in these situations. And the uncertainty of judgments made under such conditions have to filter down into the testimonies given and into our reading and interpretation of those testimonies. So in conclusion, my response to this challenge is not to refute it, but to return to the idea of the complex historical reality of the Holocaust. The reality that confronted the various witnesses I've cited was complex, and this applies as much to the norms they perceived as to other aspects of their experience. One well-known historiographical response is to seek non-testimonial sources to confirm or disconfirm these kinds of testimonial claims. And that might work. I think it does work well in the case of legal norms. It's a characteristic fact about Holocaust historiography. We have the documents, right? But it doesn't get us far when evaluating changes about moral norms or changes or breakdowns in other kinds of norms. So ultimately, this is the conclusion, the question comes to how austere we want our historiography of the Holocaust to be. And it's not my place to make a definitive judgment on this point. The book by Noah Schenker that was cited earlier has some interesting reflections on this question. But I want to close with an observation. This is the observation that our own everyday judgments about norms are partial, provisional, and prone to revision based on newly acquired information or experiences. I don't think we can responsibly exclude norms or changes in norms from our historical understanding of the Holocaust, but we can't demand that testimonial sources are infallible where we ourselves are not. Thank you.